There are some things even power can't control. Riccardo Mancini understood this better than most men ever would. He'd built an empire brick by brick, decision by decision, consequence by consequence. He knew how to make cities bend. How to turn enemies into allies and problems into opportunities. But none of that mattered when he looked across the breakfast table at his 8-year-old son and saw only emptiness staring back. Matteo hadn't smiled in 22 months. Hadn't laughed. Hadn't spoken a single word since the morning his mother collapsed and never got back up. And Riccardo, who'd solved impossible problems his entire life, had no idea how to fix this one. The penthouse overlooking the city was supposed to represent everything Riccardo had achieved. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the sprawl below, endless lights, movement, life happening everywhere except here. Inside, glass and marble stretched across open spaces filled with expensive furniture and abstract art that cost more than most people earned in years. Everything positioned with precision. Everything controlled. Yet the entire space felt hollow, as if all that money and influence couldn't fill the one thing it lacked: warmth. 8-year-old Matteo sat at the long dining table, his small body nearly swallowed by the high-backed leather chair. His legs dangled well above the floor, swinging occasionally in empty air. Before him sat breakfast prepared by the housekeeper: scrambled eggs, turkey sausage, whole grain toast cut into triangles. He stared past it all, his dark eyes focused on something no one else could see. "Matteo tesoro, you should eat." Elena's voice came softly. She was in her late 50s, gray streaking through dark hair pulled into a practical bun. She'd been with the Mancini family for nearly a decade, hired when Matteo's mother was still alive, still laughing, still filling rooms with life. Now, Elena was the closest thing to gentleness the boy had left. She set orange juice beside his plate, her hand briefly resting on his thin shoulder. "Your father has something special planned today." Matteo didn't respond. He never did. Elena's expression softened with the kind of sadness that settled into bones after watching someone you loved disappear inside themselves. "Hey friend, kindly subscribe to Undiluted Romance Stories. It's 1 second for you but a big deal for me." 2 years ago, closer to 22 months now, Matteo had been different. Not loud, never loud, but present. He'd asked questions constantly. Why did some buildings have more windows than others? Where did his father go in the black car? Why did his mother's perfume smell like flowers that didn't grow in the city? His mother, Sophia, had loved those questions. She'd sit with him for hours, answering everything with patience Riccardo had never possessed. Then she was gone. One moment she was laughing at something Matteo had drawn. The next, she was on the floor, paramedics rushing in, sirens screaming, an ambulance that never brought her back. The doctors said it was sudden. Aneurysm. Nothing anyone could have prevented. But Matteo had seen her collapse. Had watched her stop moving. Had stood in the hallway as strangers carried her away. And something inside him had closed like a door locking from the inside. The silence came in pieces at first. Shorter answers. Longer pauses. Then one morning, he simply stopped speaking altogether. No words. No cries. No laughter. Just observation, quiet, careful, endless observation, and nothing more. Riccardo had responded the only way he knew how, with money and control. Specialists from Switzerland and New York. Trauma experts with degrees from Harvard and Oxford. Therapists who spoke in soft tones and charged brutal fees. They'd all said the same thing. There's no medical cause. It's emotional. He'll speak when he feels safe again. Safe. As if Riccardo Mancini, who controlled territories and made powerful men nervous with a glance, couldn't provide that for his own son. The sound of footsteps on marble announced Riccardo's arrival. He entered the dining room with absolute authority. Tall, broad-shouldered, dark hair showing just enough gray at the temples to suggest experience rather than age. Even in casual morning clothes, tailored black pants, white dress shirt open at the collar, he radiated power. "Good morning, Matteo," Riccardo said, his voice measured. He took his seat at the head of the table and reached for the espresso Elena had prepared. "Did you sleep well?" Matteo's eyes shifted toward his father. But there was no nod, no acknowledgement. Just that same distant stare, present but unreachable. Riccardo's jaw tightened. Barely. Most people wouldn't have noticed. But Elena, who'd watched this routine hundreds of times, saw the frustration beneath his composed exterior. Not anger, Ricardo had never raised his voice at his son, but something heavier. Helplessness. "We're going out today," Ricardo continued, unfolding his napkin with deliberate precision. "Somewhere different. A cafe I used to visit before." He paused. "Before things changed." "Nothing. They make good pancakes. Chocolate chip." Ricardo watched his son's face, searching for any flicker of interest. Maybe there was something, a slight shift, or maybe just light moving across his features. "We'll leave after you finish breakfast." His gaze dropped to the untouched plate. "Eat, Matteo. You're already too thin." Elena moved quietly through the room, but her attention never left the boy. She'd learned to read him. The way he pushed food around when disconnected. How he gravitated toward windows when walls felt too close. The tension in his shoulders when overwhelmed. Right now, he was folding into himself, becoming as small and invisible as possible. "Mr. Mancini," Elena ventured carefully. "Matteo usually has tutoring with Dr. Ambrose on Tuesdays." "I've rescheduled Dr. Ambrose," Ricardo cut in, not unkindly, but with finality. "The therapists say he needs to be out in the world." He glanced at Elena. "Make sure he's dressed comfortably." "Of course." Ricardo watched Matteo pick up his fork and begin eating, mechanical, joyless movements. Each bite a reminder of what had been lost. After Sofia died, Ricardo had buried himself in work. It was simpler to manage territory disputes than to face the emptiness in his son's eyes. Easier to control an empire than to reach a broken 8-year-old. His own father had raised him with an iron fist and minimal affection. "Strength doesn't apologize," his father used to say. "Emotion is leverage for your enemies." Ricardo had learned that lesson so well that now, faced with a problem that couldn't be solved through strategy or force, he found himself completely lost. "I have a call at 9:30, Ricardo said, checking his watch. "We leave at 10. Tell Marco to have the car ready. Low profile today." "Yes, Mr. Mancini." As Elena left, Ricardo and Matteo sat in silence. The city hummed beyond the windows. A clock ticked somewhere, marking time that felt both infinite and suffocating. Ricardo studied his son, this small silent stranger who should be running, laughing, filling the penthouse with chaos and life. Instead, there was only this fragile shell. For the first time in years, Ricardo Mancini, who commanded respect from the most dangerous men in the city, felt genuinely afraid. Because he was taking his son out into the world. And he had absolutely no idea if it would help. Or if it would break what little remained. The car pulled away from the penthouse tower at exactly 10 o'clock. Not the usual armored SUV with tinted windows and a 2-vehicle escort. Today it was just a black sedan, expensive but unremarkable, with Marco behind the wheel and Ricardo and Matteo in the backseat. Marco had been with Ricardo for 12 years. He knew when to talk and when silence was the better option. Today was a silence day. Matteo sat pressed against the window, his small hands folded in his lap, eyes tracking every detail outside. A woman walking 3 dogs. A delivery truck double-parked. A man in a suit checking his phone at a crosswalk. The boy's gaze moved constantly, absorbing everything, cataloging patterns, assessing threats he shouldn't have needed to understand at 8 years old. Ricardo watched his son and felt something tighten in his chest. This hyper-awareness hadn't existed before Sofia died. Matteo used to stare out windows and daydream, asking questions about clouds and birds and where roads ended. Now he watched the world like someone expecting danger from every direction. Because he'd learned that safety was an illusion. That the people you loved could disappear without warning. And Ricardo had taught him the rest, how to notice who was watching, which cars stayed too close, why certain people carried themselves with concealed intent. Lessons no child should need. Lessons that came with the life Ricardo had chosen long before Matteo was born. "We're going somewhere quiet," Ricardo said, breaking the silence. "Somewhere normal. You don't need to worry today." Matteo's eyes shifted briefly toward his father, then returned to the window. No acknowledgement. No trust. Ricardo looked away, jaw tight. The cafe sat on a tree-lined street in a neighborhood that had somehow resisted both gentrification and decay. Small shops, a bookstore, a dry cleaner that had been there for 40 years. The kind of area where people knew their neighbors and nobody asked too many questions. Marco pulled to the curb. "I'll be across the street, Mr. Mancini. You need me, I'm 30 seconds away." "I know." Riccardo opened his door, then moved around to help Matteo out. The boy climbed out on his own, as he always did, but stayed close to Riccardo's side. Not holding his hand, Matteo hadn't done that in over a year, but near enough. The cafe had a green awning with hand-painted letters, Stella's Kitchen. Through the windows, Riccardo could see warm wood tables, hanging Edison bulbs, mismatched chairs that somehow worked together. A chalkboard menu. Customers scattered throughout, couples, solo readers, a woman working on a laptop. Normal. Unremarkably, beautifully normal. Riccardo pushed open the door. A small bell chimed. The smell hit them immediately. Coffee, toasted bread, something sweet baking in the back. Cinnamon, maybe. Vanilla. The kind of smells that belonged in memories of childhood, though Riccardo's childhood had held few moments like this. Matteo stopped just inside the entrance, his small body going very still. His eyes swept the space with that same careful assessment. Counting exits. Noting who sat where. Old habits learned too young. "This way," Riccardo said quietly, guiding him toward a table near the window but not directly in front of it. Visible enough to seem normal, positioned enough to see the whole room. They sat. Matteo in the chair facing the door, Riccardo let him choose without comment. The boy's hands rested on the table, fingers occasionally tapping a silent rhythm only he could hear. Around them, life happened in small, ordinary ways. At the table beside them, an elderly couple shared a crossword puzzle, debating answers in comfortable disagreement. Near the window, two women laughed over iced coffee, one gesturing wildly with her hands. A man in paint-stained jeans sat alone, sketching in a worn notebook. And at a corner table, a little girl, maybe 6, was completely destroying a chocolate chip muffin while her mother tried unsuccessfully to keep crumbs contained. Matteo's gaze lingered on the girl. She was messy, loud, unself-conscious in the way children were supposed to be. Chocolate on her fingers. Crumbs on her shirt. Giggling at something only she found funny. Everything Matteo wasn't anymore. Riccardo saw where his son was looking and felt that familiar ache. The reminder of what had been stolen. What he didn't know how to give back. The cafe door opened again. More customers. A teenager with headphones. A businessman grabbing takeout. The bell chimed each time, and each time, Matteo's shoulders tensed slightly before relaxing again. Always watching. Never at ease. Riccardo wanted to tell him he could relax here. That not every place required vigilance. But he'd be lying. In Riccardo's world, everywhere required vigilance. Even a quiet cafe on a Tuesday morning. He'd made sure Marco was positioned with a clear sight line. Had chosen a neighborhood where his enemies were unlikely to venture. Had timed their arrival for the lull between breakfast rush and lunch prep. Even here, even now, Riccardo Mancini was calculating angles and assessing risk. Because that's what men like him did. Even when they were just trying to buy their son pancakes. A menu appeared on their table, placed there by a passing server Riccardo hadn't noticed approaching. Simple laminated paper, handwritten specials, nothing fancy. Riccardo picked it up, scanning options he wasn't really reading. They have chocolate chip pancakes. And regular. Blueberry. Strawberry. He glanced at Matteo. What sounds good? Nothing. We could get a few different kinds. Share them. Matteo's fingers continued their silent tapping. His gaze had moved from the little girl to the window, watching people pass by on the sidewalk outside. A jogger. Someone walking a golden retriever. Life moving forward while Matteo stayed frozen. Riccardo set down the menu and leaned back, forcing himself to wait. To not push. To let Matteo exist without demands. It was harder than commanding a room full of dangerous men. The cafe hummed with quiet conversation and clinking dishes. Someone laughed. The espresso machine hissed. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm. Cars passing, people living, the world refusing to stop just because one small boy had forgotten how. Riccardo checked his watch. 10:18. They'd been here less than 5 minutes, and already he felt exposed in a way he never did in boardrooms or backroom negotiations. Here, he wasn't Riccardo Mancini. He was just a father who didn't know how to help his son. And that was more terrifying than anything he'd faced in 20 years of building an empire. He was about to say something, anything to fill the silence, when he saw her approaching from the corner of his eye. A waitress, mid-20s maybe, dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing the cafe's standard uniform of black pants and a green apron. She carried a notepad and moved with the easy confidence of someone who'd worked here long enough to know every table, every regular, every order by heart. But it wasn't her experience that made Ricardo notice her. It was the way she was looking at Matteo. Not with pity. Not with curiosity. Not with the careful walking on eggshells expression most people wore when they sensed something was different about the quiet child who never spoke. She was smiling at him. Just smiling. Like he was exactly who he was supposed to be. Good morning. Her voice was warm but not overly sweet. Natural. The kind of voice that didn't try too hard to be anything other than what it was. She stopped beside their table, her attention settling on Matteo first, not Ricardo. That's a serious-looking hoodie you've got there. Navy blue suits you. Matteo's eyes lifted briefly to her face, then dropped back to the table. No response. No acknowledgement beyond that single glance. Most people stumbled at this point. They'd push harder, try different approaches, or retreat into awkward overcompensation. Adults who didn't know how to handle a child who wouldn't engage. This waitress did something different. She simply let it be. I'm Serena, she said, turning to Ricardo with that same easy demeanor. No stiffening at his expensive clothes. No recognition of who he might be. No change in her expression at all. Can I start you both with something to drink? Ricardo found himself slightly off balance. People didn't usually treat him like just another customer. Coffee. Black. And for you? Serena asked Matteo directly, as if she fully expected an answer even though none was coming. When Matteo remained silent, she didn't flinch. Didn't fill the space with nervous chatter. She just waited, not uncomfortably, but with genuine patience, before offering, milk? Juice? Hot chocolate if you're feeling adventurous. Matteo's fingers stopped their tapping. Just for a second. Serena noticed. Ricardo saw her notice. But she didn't make a production of it. Tell you what, she said, pulling the menu from where Ricardo had left it and turning it sideways, sliding it gently in front of Matteo so the drink section faced him directly. You don't have to decide right now. Breakfast tastes better when you take your time anyway. She tapped the laminated paper lightly. Just point when you're ready. I'll check back in a few minutes. Then she straightened, gave them both a quick smile, genuine, not performed, and walked away. No hovering. No pressure. No treating Matteo like he was broken. Just space. Ricardo stared after her, something unfamiliar settling in his chest. In 2 years of specialists and therapists and well-meaning strangers, no one had approached Matteo quite like that. They either tried too hard, speaking in exaggerated cheerful tones, asking too many questions, demanding engagement, or they treated him like glass, like one wrong word might shatter him completely. This woman had done neither. She'd simply given his son a choice. And then walked away to let him make it. Ricardo looked at Matteo. The boy was staring at the menu now, actually looking at it, his small hand resting near the edge of the paper. Not quite touching it, but closer than he'd been to anything interactive in weeks. Do you see something you want? Ricardo asked carefully. Matteo didn't answer. But his eyes were scanning the options: hot chocolate, orange juice, apple juice, milk. Reading. Considering. Processing in that silent way he did everything now. Ricardo forced himself to look away. To not push. To give Matteo the same space Serena had given him. Around them, the cafe continued its gentle rhythm. The elderly couple had moved on to a new crossword clue. The little girl with the muffin was now begging for more. Coffee grinders whirred. Plates clinked. Life happened in small, unremarkable ways that somehow felt monumental. Because for the first time in months, Matteo was looking at something by choice. Not because a therapist had placed it in front of him. Not because Elena had gently encouraged him. But because a waitress had offered him agency without expectation. Serena returned exactly when she said she would, not too soon, not too long. She carried a small tray with Ricardo's coffee and set it down smoothly. Then she looked at Matteo. "Any decisions?" she asked, her tone genuinely curious, not demanding. Matteo's hand moved. Slowly. Deliberately. His finger extended and touched the menu, right beside the words hot chocolate. It was the first unprompted choice he'd made all morning. Ricardo's breath caught. He didn't move. Didn't speak. Didn't risk breaking whatever fragile moment was happening. "Hot chocolate it is," Serena said, as if this were the most normal transaction in the world. No celebration. No drawing attention to the significance. She simply wrote it down. "Good choice. The cook makes it with real chocolate, not the powder stuff. You want whipped cream?" Matteo hesitated, then nodded. Once. Barely perceptible. But it was there. Serena's smile widened just slightly. "Perfect. I'll be right back with that." She turned to Ricardo. "Have you decided on food, or do you need another minute?" Ricardo realized he'd completely forgotten about food. "Pancakes. Chocolate chip. 2 orders. Coming up." As she walked away, Ricardo exhaled slowly. His hands, resting on the table, had formed into fists without him realizing it. He relaxed them deliberately, feeling tension drain from muscles he hadn't known were tight. Matteo had nodded. Such a small thing. Insignificant to anyone watching. But to Ricardo, it felt like witnessing something impossible. The hot chocolate arrived first. Serena placed it carefully within Matteo's reach, close enough to access, far enough that he didn't feel crowded. Whipped cream piled high, dusted with cocoa powder. A small chocolate chip cookie balanced on the saucer. "That's a gift," she said, nodding at the cookie. "First-time customers get one. House rules." Matteo looked at it. Actually looked at it, not through it. Then Serena did something that stopped Ricardo cold. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small piece of folded paper and a pencil. Without ceremony, without explanation, she set them on the table between Matteo and the hot chocolate. "I draw when I'm thinking," she said casually, as if talking to herself as much as to them. "Helps quiet the noise up here." She tapped her temple lightly. Sometimes words are overrated anyway. And then she walked away. Just like that. No expectation that Matteo would use them. No instruction. No therapeutic purpose announced. Just an offering. An invitation to exist however he needed to. Ricardo stared at the paper and pencil. Then at his son. Matteo was staring at them too. His hand hovered near the pencil, not quite touching it, as if testing whether it was real. Whether it was safe. The cafe noise faded into background static. The whole world narrowed to this moment. This small boy, this folded paper, this ordinary pencil that suddenly felt like the most important object in the room. And then, so slowly Ricardo almost missed it, Matteo's fingers wrapped around the pencil. Picked it up. Held it. It was the first thing he'd chosen to touch, not because someone put it in his hand, not because routine demanded it, but because he wanted to. Ricardo's throat tightened. He looked away quickly, blinking against something that felt dangerously close to tears. Men like him didn't cry. Didn't break. Didn't show weakness. But watching his son hold a pencil felt like watching a miracle. And across the cafe, Serena refilled someone's coffee, completely unaware that she'd just given Riccardo Mancini something his money and power never could. Hope. Ricardo forced himself to breathe normally. To not stare. To not reach across the table and acknowledge what was happening because any attention might shatter the moment completely. So he did the hardest thing he'd ever done. He sat still. Picked up his coffee. Took a sip he didn't taste. And let his son exist without interference. Matteo unfolded the paper slowly, smoothing it against the table with careful precision. The pencil hovered above the blank surface for several seconds, indecision or perhaps consideration, Ricardo couldn't tell. Then the pencil touched paper. A line appeared. Hesitant at first, then more confident. Another line. And another. Not random marks, but deliberate strokes forming something Ricardo couldn't yet identify from his angle. Matteo's whole body had changed. The tension in his small shoulders had eased slightly. His breathing had evened out. The hypervigilance that usually kept his spine rigid had softened into something closer to focus. He was drawing. Actually drawing. Ricardo remembered, God, it hurt to remember, how Matteo used to draw constantly. Before. When Sofia was alive, their refrigerator had been covered in crayon masterpieces. Rocket ships and dinosaurs and families holding hands under impossible yellow suns. Sofia had kept every single one, filing them in a box she'd labeled Matteo's gallery. That box was still in the penthouse somewhere. Ricardo hadn't been able to look at it since she died. And now, here in a cafe that smelled like coffee and cinnamon, his son was drawing again. For no reason except that he wanted to. The pancakes arrived while Matteo was still absorbed in his work. Serena set them down quietly, her movements economical and respectful of the concentration happening at the table. Chocolate chip special, she said, sliding one plate toward each of them. Fair warning, they're massive. Nobody ever finishes a full stack here. She glanced at what Matteo was drawing and smiled, but didn't comment on it. Didn't ask to see it. Didn't make it into a thing. She just acknowledged it existed and moved on. But she didn't leave immediately. Instead, she refilled Ricardo's coffee and then, almost casually, began wiping down the already clean table next to theirs. You know, she said, her tone conversational, aimed at the space between them rather than directly at either one, I used to work at a hospital cafe. Different place entirely, but same basic job. Coffee, food, small talk. Ricardo found himself listening despite not understanding why she was telling them this. There was this old man who came in every single day for 15 years. Same table. Same order, black coffee, dry wheat toast, soft-boiled egg. Exactly the same, every morning. She moved to wiping the condiment holder, her hands busy, her voice easy. Then one day, this was maybe 3 years into me working there, he ordered something different. French toast. With syrup. She paused, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. He laughed when it arrived. Actually laughed out loud, like he'd gotten away with some kind of crime. And you know what he told me? She glanced up, not quite at them, but in their direction. He said, I spent 15 years thinking I couldn't change my order. Not because anyone told me I couldn't. But because I'd convinced myself the routine was safer than the risk. Serena straightened, tossing her towel over her shoulder. Sometimes small changes feel dangerous, she said quietly. But they're not. She wasn't looking at Matteo when she said it. She wasn't even looking at Ricardo. But the words landed anyway. And Ricardo felt them settle somewhere deep in his chest, this story about routine and fear and the lie of safety. He'd built his entire life on control. On knowing every variable, managing every risk, eliminating every threat before it materialized. He'd convinced himself that structure would protect his son, that enough specialists and enough money and enough carefully managed environments would somehow heal what grief had broken. But control hadn't helped Matteo. It had just built higher walls. Serena walked away, leaving them alone with pancakes and half-finished hot chocolate and a piece of paper covered in pencil marks. Ricardo cut into his stack, mechanical movements, barely tasting the food. Across from him, Matteo had set down the pencil and was now looking at his own pancakes. Actually considering them. He picked up his fork, cut a small piece, lifted it to his mouth, and ate. Not because Elena had encouraged him. Not because it was routine. Not because someone was watching and waiting for him to perform the basic function of eating. He ate because he was hungry. Because the food was in front of him. Because it was his choice. Such small things. Insignificant to anyone watching. But to Ricardo, each one felt like watching his son come back from somewhere very far away. They ate in silence. But it wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the penthouse. This was different. Softer somehow. The kind of silence that existed between people who didn't need words to fill space. Around them, the cafe continued its gentle rhythm. Conversations rose and fell. The espresso machine hissed. Someone's phone buzzed. Outside, the morning sun had fully emerged, painting everything in warm golden light. And at their small table by the window, a father and son shared a meal. Just that. Nothing more complicated. But for Riccardo Mancini, who'd spent 2 years trying to fix his son with money and experts and desperate feudal control, it felt like the first real meal they'd had since Sofia died. Matteo finished about half his pancakes, which was more than he usually ate. He pushed the plate away gently and returned to his drawing, adding details, shading, building something that was taking shape in ways Ricardo still couldn't fully see from his angle. Ricardo didn't ask what he was drawing. Didn't try to engage. Didn't push for connection. He just sat there. Present. Available. Not demanding anything. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, that felt like enough. Serena came by once more to check on them, her approach quiet, unobtrusive. "How are we doing?" she asked, her gaze sweeping over their half-eaten food. Mateo's continued work, the general state of contentment at the table. "Good," Ricardo said. It might have been the most honest word he'd spoken in months. Serena smiled. Started to turn away. And then Mateo did something that stopped time. He looked up. Not past her. Not around her. Not through her with those distant, unreachable eyes. At her. Directly at her face. And for a fraction of a second, no more than a heartbeat, something shifted in his expression. Something that looked almost like the beginning of a smile. It wasn't laughter. It wasn't joy breaking through like sunlight after storm. It was smaller than that. More fragile. Real in a way that made Ricardo's heart stop completely. The corner of Mateo's mouth lifted. Barely. A subtle shift in his expression that someone not watching carefully might have missed entirely. But it was there. A smile. Tiny. Uncertain. Genuine. The first one in 22 months. Ricardo froze. Every instinct screamed at him to react, to acknowledge it, to grab hold of this moment and demand it become permanent. But something deeper, some father's intuition he didn't know he possessed, kept him absolutely still. "Don't move. Don't speak. Don't ruin this." Across the table, Mateo's eyes remained locked on Serena's face. The almost smile lingered for another second, maybe two, before fading back into his usual careful neutrality. But it had been there. Ricardo had seen it. And more importantly, so had Serena. And here's what broke something open in Ricardo's chest. Serena didn't react. She didn't gasp. Didn't exclaim. Didn't drop to Mateo's level and make a production of what had just happened. Didn't call attention to the miracle Ricardo had just witnessed. She simply held Mateo's gaze for one quiet moment. And then she nodded. Just that. A small acknowledgement. As if to say, "I see you. I see what you just gave. And I'm not going to make you regret it." "I'll grab your check," she said, her voice unchanged, easy as before. As if the earth hadn't just shifted beneath Ricardo's feet. She turned and walked away, giving them space, protecting the fragile thing that had just bloomed at their table. Ricardo's hands were shaking. He gripped his coffee cup to hide it, but he could feel tremors running through his entire body. Adrenaline. Relief. Something bigger than both that he didn't have words for. Mateo had smiled. Not at a therapist employing carefully crafted techniques. Not at Elena with her gentle, practiced patience. Not even at his father, who'd tried everything and failed at all of it. At a waitress who'd simply treated him like a person worthy of choice. Ricardo looked at his son. Mateo had returned to his drawing, his small hand moving the pencil across paper with continued focus. As if nothing had happened. As if he hadn't just done the impossible. But his shoulders were different. Looser. The rigid tension that had become his permanent state had softened just slightly. He'd smiled. And the world hadn't ended. That's what Ricardo understood, watching him. Mateo had let himself feel something, however brief, and survived it. No punishment. No pain. No loss following immediately after. Just a moment. And then return to safety. It was more than progress. It was proof. Proof that the walls Mateo had built could have doors. That the silence could have breaks. That the child who disappeared into grief might, someday, find his way back. Ricardo didn't speak. Didn't reach across the table. Didn't try to force acknowledgement or connection. He simply existed in the moment with his son, letting it be exactly what it was. Nothing more. Nothing less. Serena returned a few minutes later with their check, but she carried something else too, a small to-go container, white cardboard with a clear window on top. She set the check down near Ricardo, then placed the container gently beside Mateo's drawing. "Leftover pancakes," she said. "Can't let good food go to waste." She tapped the container lightly. "Plus, some things are better when you're ready for them." No rush. Inside, Ricardo could see she'd wrapped the remaining pancakes carefully, adding a few fresh strawberries and an extra chocolate chip cookie that definitely hadn't been on either of their plates. It was a kindness. Simple. Unearned. Given freely without expectation of anything in return. The kind of gesture Sophia used to make, seeing what people needed before they asked. Thank you, Ricardo managed, his voice rougher than intended. Serena smiled. You're welcome. She glanced at Mateo's drawing, still not asking to see it fully, just acknowledging it existed. That's really good work. You've got talent. Mateo didn't look up. But his pencil paused. Just for a second. He'd heard her. Registered the compliment. Let it exist without pushing it away. Another small victory in a morning full of them. You both take care, Serena said, straightening. Hope to see you again sometime. And then she was gone, moving to another table, another customer, carrying on with her day as if she hadn't just helped put a broken child back together. Ricardo paid the check with cash, too much, but he didn't care, and left it on the table. He stood slowly, not wanting to break whatever spell had settled over them. Ready? He asked Mateo quietly. Mateo carefully folded his drawing, creasing it precisely in half, and tucked it into the pocket of his hoodie. He picked up the container of pancakes, slid off his chair, and stood beside his father. Still silent. Still distant in so many ways. But different. Outside, the morning had warmed into something bright and promising. Marco was exactly where he'd said he'd be, across the street, leaning against the sedan, watching. Ricardo placed his hand lightly on Mateo's shoulder as they walked to the car. Not gripping. Not steering. Just there. A point of contact that said, I'm with you. You're not alone. Mateo didn't pull away. Marco opened the rear door, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes flickered to Ricardo's face with a question. Ricardo gave the slightest shake of his head. Later. Not now. They settled into the back seat. Mateo clutched the pancake container on his lap, protective of it in a way he hadn't been protective of anything in months. As Marco pulled into traffic, Ricardo looked out the window at the cafe growing smaller behind them. Stella's Kitchen. He'd remember that name. In his pocket, his phone buzzed. Meetings. Business. The empire that never stopped demanding his attention. Ricardo pulled it out, looked at the calendar full of obligations, and made a decision that would have shocked anyone who knew him. He opened the scheduling app and blocked off the same time next Tuesday. Then the Tuesday after that. And the one after that. 6 weeks of Tuesday mornings, marked simply, reserved. Because empires could wait. Miracles couldn't. And Riccardo Mancini had just learned something that 2 years of specialists couldn't teach him. Some things couldn't be forced or bought or controlled into existence. Some things required patience. And his son was worth waiting for. The drive back to the penthouse was quiet, but it was a different kind of silence than the one they'd left with that morning. Mateo sat with the pancake container balanced carefully on his lap, both hands securing it as if it contained something precious. His gaze was directed out the window, watching the city scroll past, but there was something less guarded in his posture. The hypervigilance hadn't disappeared completely, Ricardo doubted it ever would, not with the life they lived, but it had softened at the edges. Ricardo didn't ask questions. Didn't try to process what had happened out loud. Didn't make the mistake of turning a fragile moment into an interrogation. He simply sat beside his son and let the morning exist exactly as it had been. Perfect in its imperfection. Marco navigated traffic with his usual efficiency, taking the long route without being asked. He understood without explanation that Ricardo wasn't in a hurry to return to the demands waiting in the penthouse. At a stoplight, Mateo shifted the container slightly and glanced down at it. Through the clear window, the pancakes and strawberries and cookie were visible, small kindnesses wrapped in cardboard. Some things are better when you're ready for them, Serena had said. Ricardo wondered if she'd meant more than just pancakes. They arrived home to find Elena waiting in the foyer, her expression cautiously hopeful. How did it go? She asked carefully, her eyes searching first Ricardo's face, then Mateo's. Good, Ricardo said. Just that. Because anything more would have required explaining something he didn't fully understand himself. But Elena, who'd watched Mateo every day for 2 years, saw something in the boy's face. A subtle shift. An almost lightness that hadn't been there when they'd left. "I'm glad," she said quietly. Then to Matteo, "Are you hungry for lunch, or did you already eat?" Matteo held up the container slightly. Not quite an answer, but an acknowledgement. A response. Elena's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. "I see. Well, whenever you're ready, just let me know." She didn't push. Didn't make assumptions. Just accepted what was offered and moved on. She'd learned, over these long months, to take what victories came. Matteo headed toward his room, still clutching the container. His steps were unhurried, his small frame disappearing down the hallway with purpose rather than retreat. Riccardo watched him go, feeling something settle in his chest. "Mr. Mancini," Elena ventured, "I've never seen him hold on to something like that before." "I know. Whatever happened there, perhaps it should happen again." "It will," Riccardo said. And meant it. That night, after business calls he'd barely paid attention to and emails he'd answered on autopilot, Riccardo stood in the doorway of Matteo's room. The boy was already in bed, the container from the cafe sitting on his nightstand. Unopened. Waiting. On the desk across the room, the folded drawing sat beside Matteo's schoolbooks. Riccardo hadn't asked to see it. Hadn't tried to peek when Matteo wasn't looking. Some things were private. Some things belonged only to the person who created them. "Good night, Matteo," Riccardo said softly. Matteo's eyes opened slightly. He looked at his father, really looked, not through him, and gave the smallest nod. Riccardo's throat tightened. "Sleep well." He pulled the door mostly closed, leaving it cracked the way Matteo preferred, and walked back to his own room with something that felt dangerously close to hope beating in his chest. Across the city, in a small apartment above a laundromat, Serena kicked off her work shoes and collapsed onto her second-hand couch. Her roommate, Maya, looked up from her laptop. "Long shift." "Not too bad," Serena said, reaching for the remote. "Pretty standard Tuesday. Though there was this father and son who came in." "Yeah." Serena paused, thinking about the well-dressed man with careful eyes and the silent boy who'd smiled at her for just a second. You could tell he was trying really hard. The dad. Like he didn't know exactly what he was doing, but he was showing up anyway. "That's sweet." "Yeah." Serena stretched, already putting the interaction in the same mental folder where she kept all the regulars and one-time customers who passed through Stella's kitchen. "I hope they come back." She had no idea who Riccardo Mancini was. Didn't know about the empire he controlled or the power he wielded or the dangerous world he navigated daily. To her, he was just a tired father with an expensive suit and a quiet son who needed space more than he needed solutions. And sometimes, that ignorance was the greatest gift she could have given. Because she treated them exactly like everyone else. Normal. Human. Worthy of simple kindness without strings attached. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning at exactly 10 o'clock, a black sedan pulled up to Stella's kitchen again. Riccardo and Matteo walked in together. This time, Matteo didn't pause at the door quite as long. His assessment of the room was quicker, more familiar. Progress measured in seconds. Serena looked up from the register and smiled. "Well, look who's back. Hot chocolate with whipped cream." Matteo nodded. Once. Clear and deliberate. Then he did something that made Riccardo's heart skip. He looked at Serena and raised his hand slightly, a small wave. Still no words. Not yet. Maybe not for a while still. But communication. Connection. Choice. "Your usual table's open," Serena said, as if she'd been expecting them. Maybe she had been. "I'll bring you both some menus." They sat. The same table by the window. The same comfortable chairs. The same smell of coffee and cinnamon and possibility. And when Serena brought the menus, she brought something else too, 2 pieces of folded paper and 2 pencils. "In case inspiration strikes," she said simply. Matteo picked up his pencil without hesitation this time. And began to draw. Riccardo watched his son, this small miracle happening in slow motion, and understood something fundamental. He'd spent his entire life building power. Accumulating control. Learning to bend the world to his will through force and strategy and calculated risk. But all of that, every territory claimed, every deal closed, every empire built, meant nothing compared to this. His son. Drawing. Breathing easier. existing in the world with slightly less fear than the week before. Healing couldn't be bought. It couldn't be forced or controlled or managed into existence. It required patience, presence, and the willingness to accept that some battles weren't won through strength. Some were won by simply showing up. Again and again. For as long as it took. Riccardo Mancini had commanded respect from the most dangerous men in the city. Had built an empire that would outlast him. But his greatest achievement would always be this. Learning to wait. Learning to hope. Learning that sometimes, love meant letting go of everything except presence. And accepting that for a father trying to reach his son, that was enough. It had to be. Because across the table, Matteo was smiling again. Small. Fragile. Real. And that was everything.